In the previous module, we saw that the lack of decline in U.S. poverty rates since the 1960s is partially explained by the increase in female-headed families, which pushed poverty rates up and counteracted other factors that might have reduced poverty. We then considered one set of these other factors, economic growth. There, we noted that while economic growth has been strong, it has also been accompanied by rising inequality and declining wages for many. These two factors together, economic growth and declining wages, do a fairly good job of predicting the relatively flat poverty rates we've seen, at least since the 1980s. In this module, we return to a point made at the beginning of this week's lectures, and one made frequently in policy debates concerning poverty. The War on Poverty, launched in 1964, included a number of welfare and assistance programs, many of which remain in operation to this day. This raises the question of why these investments have not had more success in pushing poverty rates down. In this module, we'll turn to this question and consider in more detail how welfare programs relate to poverty rates. Before we look at detailed information on safety net programs, we should also consider other ways the welfare system could affect the degree of poverty we see. Holding all else constant, a welfare system that provides greater income to a greater number of the poor should be associated with less poverty. This, however, ignores the possibility that individuals might change their behavior, including the amount of work they perform, in response to the generosity of the welfare system. When we take this possible behavioral response to welfare into account, we see that there are actually two major ways in which the safety net or welfare system might affect the poverty rate. First, there's a direct or mechanical effect of giving poor individuals more income through welfare. This would suggest that higher welfare benefits or providing assistance to more people could raise income and lower poverty. Second, however, if higher benefits encourage dependency and reduce work effort, higher benefits over a long time frame could actually result in more poverty, an idea we'll evaluate in a more careful way in the next few weeks. For now, however, it should be clear that we need to know about long-term trends in welfare spending and benefit levels to understand if they help explain the long-term trend in poverty. For the next few minutes, we'll talk about safety net programs, by which I mean a variety of programs aimed at providing assistance to low-income individuals and families, also referred to sometimes as welfare or transfer programs. We'll start by focusing on our major cash welfare program for the poor, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or TANF, from 1996 to the present, and its predecessor, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC. Both of these programs go primarily to single-parent families with children. There are certainly many other safety net programs, but TANF and AFDC are by far the largest that provide cash income to poor families. A number of other safety net programs provide assistance to the poor on an in-kind basis or through the tax system. Because the official poverty rate does not capture these non-cash benefits, we'll defer our discussion of those types of benefits for a few minutes. First, we should ask whether over time a greater or smaller number of individuals have received AFDC or TANF benefits. This figure shows these welfare programs today serve a substantially smaller fraction of both all children and of poor children than at any time in the recent past. Focusing on the fraction of all children receiving benefits, shown by the bottom blue line, this rate peaked in the early 1990s at approximately 14%, but then declined significantly throughout the 90s, following welfare reform, other policy changes, and a period of very strong economic growth. Similarly, the fraction of poor children receiving AFDC or TANF, in the top line, fell between 1970 and 1980, then rose for a decade. Since the early 90s, however, that fraction has also fallen continuously. We also may want to know whether there has been an increase in the amount of benefits going to those families that did receive AFDC or TANF. Here, the trend is also toward fewer resources being transferred to the poor through these cash welfare programs. This table shows the annual welfare benefit, adjusted for inflation, paid to poor families under the prior AFDC program from 1972 to 1994. This benefit level fell by more than 45% over the 22-year period. Following welfare reform, the TANF program replaced AFDC, and this trend continued. This graph shows the percentage change in the TANF benefit between 1996 and 2016. Most states had substantial declines in benefit amounts over this time, with nearly half of states reducing benefit amounts by more than 30%. So, the story of how welfare programs have evolved in the U.S. does not follow a long-term pattern of expanding war on poverty programs. Rather, the amount of cash welfare delivered to U.S. families has actually fallen for large parts of the past several decades, both in terms of the number of families receiving benefits and the level of benefits provided. If we consider the direct effect of the welfare system of putting resources into the hands of families and ignoring negative work incentive effects, these trends suggest that it would not be surprising for poverty rates to have increased as welfare has fallen substantially. At the same time, however, if we believe that generous cash benefits could potentially make poverty worse by encouraging dependency, there's also little evidence to support that. As benefits have fallen over time, there has not been a clear trend in poverty in either direction. A very important caveat to this finding is that cash welfare payments today make up a very small fraction of all forms of assistance. We should also consider these alternative forms of assistance. As we know, the official poverty measure does not include many of these other forms of assistance in its resource measure. Thus, to explore these other forms of assistance, we need to switch to analyzing trends using the supplemental poverty measure. This, of course, is challenging. As you know, the SPM was only developed in 2011, and so there's no government source that calculates poverty rates based on the SPM over several decades. Fortunately, researchers have recently constructed a series of measures that is similar to the SPM and allows us to consider the role of non-cash assistance in determining longer-term poverty trends. We will focus on a measure developed by a particular group of researchers that is very close to the SPM but differs in an important way. Recall that the SPM is a quasi-relative measure of poverty. It is not an absolute measure like the official rate that sets a threshold at one point in time and then makes adjustments over time based on the inflation rate. For the purposes of comparing trends in poverty with a measure that accounts for non-cash assistance, however, we would like to stick with an absolute measure. For similar reasons, researchers have created what they call an anchored SPM. That is a measure like the supplemental poverty measure in most ways, but which fixes the poverty threshold in a given year and adjusts the threshold only for inflation to apply it to other years. This figure shows the anchored SPM for the years 1968 to 2012. Specifically, the figure shows the official poverty rate and two versions of an anchored SPM measure with the poverty threshold fixed at either the beginning or end of the period. What is important to note is that using either of the SPM measures gives us a different conclusion about trends in poverty than we get using the official measure. Specifically, the SPM shows a reduction in poverty over this period from 25.6 in the initial year, using the measure anchored to 2012, to just 16%, for a decline of nearly 40% over time. While the SPM makes a number of changes to the poverty measure, this research shows that a major reason for this change in the long-term trend is the fact that the SPM includes non-cash and after-tax income. The role of non-cash transfers is particularly striking when we look at poverty rates among children. This figure shows the same set of trends in poverty with the OPM and SPM for children only. Among kids, note the dramatic decline in poverty as measured by the SPM beginning in the 1990s. Two factors, captured by the SPM but not by official poverty measures, can explain much of this decline. First, there was a major expansion in the Earned Income Tax Credit in 1992. This figure shows the rapid increase in spending through the EITC, or Earned Income Tax Credit, during the 1990s. The EITC reduces taxes paid by low-income working families and in many cases provides a substantial cash refund to those families. Given eligibility rules, the bulk of the EITC goes to families with children. Once we account for benefits to low-income working families delivered through the tax system, we see a very different trend in poverty. Similarly, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, formerly the Food Stamp Program, has also seen increases in benefit levels and participation since the 1990s. This means that more food assistance is being received by the poor and near poor, and this is captured by the SPM, but not in the official measure. In the case of SNAP, the increase in spending happened later than for the EITC. SNAP, however, was especially important in keeping poverty rates, as measured by the SPM, from rising dramatically after 2008, when the country entered a major recession. Let's conclude this module with a return to the key question considered. Why haven't safety net programs reduced poverty rates over time? The first part of the answer is that cash welfare, primarily AFDC and TANF, actually have declined over recent decades in the fraction of poor served and the amount of benefits. Thus, it's not surprising that poverty didn't decline as a result. Second, to fully consider assistance programs, we need to rethink which poverty measure we use for this analysis. When using the SPM as our poverty measure, the premise we started from, that poverty rates in the U.S. have not changed substantially over time, turns out no longer to be true. Analysis using the SPM shows that poverty has declined significantly through most of the 1970s, most recently due to expansions in aid to the poor delivered through programs such as the EITC and SNAP. In the final module, we'll consider one more adjustment to how we measure poverty that turns out to have very important implications for our conclusions about how poverty rates have evolved over time.